Okay, I think we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lucette de Metz. I'm the Head of Urban Innovation for London and Partners. For those of you who don't know us, we're London's international trade, investment and promotion agency. It's my pleasure to be your chair for today's panel discussion, which is entitled Smart Mobility, How Will We Move Around the Capital? So in today's conversation, we'll be looking at what mobility will look like in London in the medium to long term. As we know, in recent months, active travel has become ever more important to ensure London keeps moving, but we're also going to look more broadly on the role of shared and micromobility solutions more broadly, and the role they can play in keeping us all on the go. Before we start, I'd like to thank New London Architecture for organising today's event, which is part of their annual Active Travel Summit. Some of you may have already joined us this morning. This is the second of 3 webinars taking place today. So you'll also be able to join us for the final session of the day at 4:30 this afternoon, which will be in a Pechakucha format, and you'll be hearing about new ideas for future streets in post-pandemic London. The summit is part of NLA's year-round transport and infrastructure programme, championed by Steer and London and Partners, and also supported by Architects Meeker. The format for today is a panel discussion followed by open Q&A. So there's an opportunity for everyone in the audience to ask questions to all of our speakers, and you can do that throughout by using the Zoom Q&A function. Most of you are probably really familiar with Zoom, but this shows up in the bottom of your screen. So feel free to submit your questions as we go along, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can in the session today. The first part of the session will finish at 2:30, so about 60 minutes. And after that, we'll be hosting a speaker room where we'll be joined by our guests for today, which will give you the opportunity to ask more questions that we perhaps haven't had a chance to get to, or to share any further reflections with our speakers. So if you'd like to join us for that, we'll be sharing further instructions on how to do that at the end of the session. Before we formally kick off our content, we actually want to get the audience involved. And so we're going to launch a poll that will ask you, as we transition into our next phase of lockdown, how do you imagine your travel patterns will change going forward? Hopefully that have appeared on everyone's screen. You'll see it's a multiple choice question, so you can choose the one that best applies to you if you wish to participate, which of course we hope you will. Drum roll of excitement. Well, there we are. So some interesting results. So 42% of you are still thinking that you will only be traveling locally in the next 1 to 3 months. So that is in your own borough or your neighboring areas of work. So quite a significant change to what we would have normally seen in London on a usual day-to-day basis, with a lot of commuting and a lot of travel into central London. So quite some interesting insights for our panelists to reflect on as we go through this discussion. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, which is Richard Dilks. Richard is the Chief Executive of Como UK and an expert on shared mobility. He's going to kick us off today by giving a state of play and an introduction to the state of shared and micromobility in the UK and London before we enter into our panel discussion. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Lucette. Great to be here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation from London Partners and NLA. I'm Richard, Chief Executive of Como UK. That stands for Collaborative Mobility UK. We are a body for the public benefit of shared transport. We've particular historic and continuing expertise in car club and bike share. And as I'll come on to in a bit more detail, in the last few weeks, we've been adding to that in strength in the e-scooter space. We're not defined by mode, it is shared transport, as I said, so we're interested in any form of sharing that's going on. London is a really significant part of the UK's sharing mobility economy. That probably goes without saying, but worth bearing in mind, it is of all European countries, London's the most dominant big city there, so it's of huge interest, it's of global stature, and there's a huge amount going on before COVID hit. A bit of professional familiarity with London. I was formerly on the board of London Travel Watch, which is the public transport user watchdog, and also worked for London First, which is a business group in the capital. And I think as a Londoner myself as well, here I am in the suburbs, I've been feeling, as we all have, this radical behaviour experiment that we've been going through and we're continuing to go through. The poll results don't surprise me. I would have gone for the 42% option as well if I'd been allowed to vote. And undoubtedly, there's a massive groundswell towards staying more local and travelling more sustainably when we do travel, partly because the travel is much more local. Of course, there's no way in the world that all of that is going to sustain at current levels into the long term. And I'm not here to argue that it should. However, I think there is a real opportunity for London and the rest of the UK, the rest of the world, to capture some of that behaviour change. I think that would be really welcome from a sustainable transport point of view and a shared transport point of view specifically. But those points of view, I'd argue, are much less important than the big picture point, which is greenhouse gas emissions, the UK government's legally binding 2050 net zero carbon commitment, and the kinds of places that we want our developed global cities to be. And I think there's been a huge amount of stress for everybody involved in these last few months. But part of relieving that stress has been the cleaner air, has been the quieter nights, has been the lack of noise. Very, very palpable changes, speaking just as a Londoner there. However, of course, there is a double edge to this, which is, I think, fairly obvious in outline. And I'll just develop that a little bit if I might. So public transport is not the same as shared transport in my definitions. By shared, I mean sharing of cars, bikes, scooters that are part of a fleet of some kind. There are a whole variety of ways of doing that. There are more informal and formal ways of doing that. Public transport is different, but they are absolutely joined at the hip. And every shared transport operator will tell you that they are about knitting in with public transport. And actually, I think the cities that have made the best fist of this umbrella thought of sustainable transport are the ones who've been able to better knit public transport and shared transport and active travel all together. London has some way to go on that, I think, but equally has made huge progress. Now, thinking of public transport for just a second, it is obviously facing enormously strong headwinds. So is shared transport, so is every form of transport, so is aviation and so on. With public transport, there is a particular sort of set of issues for London. It is on a temporary bailout from the UK government to Transport for London, as you'll probably be aware, that tides TfL through towards the end of this year. But the diminution of travel is part of what's so double-edged here, because undoubtedly some of that diminution of travel, I think, will be the commute to work in particular in a city like London, and that will be a lot of public transport journeys that are taken out. So while there are some opportunities for shared transport specifically in that, there are also some significant threats, and I think it's slightly scary, to be honest, to think forwards to the world where the public transport network's capacity will be in any way in the medium term constrained by the sorts of constraints it's got on it at the moment. On so many levels, that just isn't sustainable. There would be an uptick to shared transport, as I say there, but there'd also be a lot of collateral damage to sustainable transport more generally. So we're hopefully going to not end up there, and we're going to go through phases of easing lockdown that enable that capacity to be released. And as we do that, certainly us at Como, and we have recently joined in an informal light touch way with other sustainable transport organisations, so the likes of Community Transport Association, Campaign for Better Transport, Living Streets, Sustrans, Bus Users UK and others, to share platforms and messages where appropriate. We're hopeful that we can capture some of the behaviour change, and that we can in particular help people not go back to the private car. I think that sometimes to people sounds a little bit strange for me to talk about the private car in a London context. I don't think most people, when they think of London and transport, immediately think of a private car. But there are 2.7 million of them in this city, and it is in fact the single most dominant transport mode in London, and by some distance. So another part of the double-edgedness here is that the private car has been available to people through the lockdown as an option where needed for key worker travel and so on, in a way that lots of other things haven't. although lots of shared transport operators have moved mountains there, and we've pulled that together on a page on our website, and it's been great to see. And private cars are fairly cheap in historic real terms, in terms of acquisition and running. If public transport is a permanently diminished option in terms of 1 year horizon planning, that will undoubtedly push quite a lot of people towards private car. So super important to get cracking now, as London is trying to do, on some of the physical infrastructure. That's really welcome to see. There's also, I think, things about operations on shared transport, which I will just touch on. So we have the e-scooter trials, which are coming. That is a UK government national piece. But it is really important that, firstly, there are some of those trials in London, and that they're done well. And in particular, by done well, a part of what I mean is that London comes together as an area for a trial. This is something that it hasn't been able to do on new mobility surface transport to date. That is all determined on a borough by borough basis within London. That's been a major drag on London's ability to get the best out of shared transport options. There are efforts afoot to bring London together on this and have a London trial area that doesn't have borough boundaries crisscrossing it, with different rules and different agreements signed between different authorities and different operators, all of which is a headache for authorities and operators, but crucially is a real headache for users, and really dampens demand. I'm very hopeful that effort is going to be successful. Certainly we're trying to support it, and I think it'd be a really important signal for London, and therefore the UK, because of London's size, to be able to send. It'd also be a really helpful example to have in other shared transport modes as we come through COVID recovery, and we're hopefully trying to have these other options beyond diminished public transport network until it can fire on all cylinders again, in particular for people to use. I think just to wrap up by giving a sense of what was going on in transport policy that pertains to London before COVID hit. A really important piece there is the bylaw, which is still a bit on ice, but still moving a bit in the background. So this is under gestation between TfL and London councils, the Collective for London Boroughs. This is about dockless vehicles, so it would, when scooters are legalised, if they're legalised, it would capture them. It's particularly aimed at dockless bike share at the moment. Lots of potential positives in this, a way of bringing London together, but not a done deal yet. And national policy also on the move. So although in ways I think yet to be fully determined, with what the Department for Transport is doing with its transport decarbonisation plan, where a couple of weeks ago it published its Setting the Challenge document, which actually set out the need for change in surface transport very acutely. And London, of course, has a huge impact on the UK's overall surface transport emissions. And also its urban strategy, which set out 9 principles by which it wants to see future urban movement. We're just starting to see, via future transport zones that governments bring forwards in other places outside London, we're just starting to see the first fruits being born of that approach. I hope and expect we'll see governments do more of this sort of thing. And I think the hopeful bit of COVID to close on is that it's hurried some of that agenda up. So we are seeing roads closed, we are seeing cycle lanes going in, which is very welcome. I'm here to push the case for making more progress on the services side of that, as well as the infrastructure. I will close there. I hope that's useful. Looking forward to questions in the debate later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think super useful to set quite a broad context, not just of what was already going on in the UK and London, but the impact that we are seeing, have seen of COVID, and what may well be to come as we go forward. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our other panelists who will be joining Richard on our virtual stage. So they are Matthew Clark, Associate for Steer. We have Francesca Levy, Program Director for Mobility at Plexel. We have Greg Lindsay, Director of Strategy at Commotion. And last but not least, Emma Silver, Head of Public Policy and Government Relations for Northern Europe and Asia Pacific at Bird. So I hope you agree, quite a diverse and very knowledgeable panel. So Matthew, I thought I might come to you first. You've of course seen the audience's first insights in terms of travel patterns and what they're likely to do. Some good insights from Richard. And I was wondering, from your perspective, do you think that micromobility solutions, e-bikes, e-scooters, so on, will become more widespread as we currently see? What will be their primary use in the kind of midterm to longer term, and how might they impact our travel patterns?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for the invite, and thanks to Lisette for the introduction. So I lead work in new mobility here at Steer, with a focus on e-mobility, shared mobility, and emerging services. So yes, to think about your question, which is thinking about e-bikes, e-scooters, and other personal mobility devices, and whether they become more widespread in London as a result of the current challenges. I think the simple answer is yes. Will they become more widely used? Yes. So I think new travel patterns will start to become established as we emerge from lockdown, especially in cities such as London. And Richard's touched on some of these, and also the poll which we opened with showed that one of those is likely to be a lower volume of travel, as people stay more locally, and perhaps are doing fewer days working in offices. We're likely to see a reduced use of public transport continuing. And as a result of this, there's likely to be a high use of personal transport. And I'm kind of dividing this into a few different categories. So in terms of what is a better use of personal transport, any form of transport where you're not using a private car, where you're using micromobility, and that of course includes cycling, is amongst the better ways of travelling around a city. In terms of the best, actually shared micromobility is a better use of infrastructure and of vehicles, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. It's worth noting that Cycle Hire in London actually saw more trips in March 2020 than it did in March 2019. So we're already starting to see those shifts. And indeed, trip lengths, based on some early analysis, have almost doubled between that time. In terms of the worst use of personal transport, the private car, as Richard indicates, is already pretty dominant in London in terms of ownership, and the danger is that this increases. So thinking about what would happen if these changes were to become more established and valued as people change their travel patterns, there are likely to be some long-lasting effects. So hopefully what we can do is to capture the better parts of these effects. So if people switch to more private car travel, this is likely to be difficult to reverse. We've had many years of trying to encourage people away from the car, and now we have central government saying that the private car is amongst the modes that should be prioritised. Maybe outside London this works, but in London this really doesn't work. If individuals purchase a bike or an e-scooter or an e-bike or some other similar mode, and they prefer it to their previous mode, then an infrastructure supports this, then we're hopeful that some of these changes can be maintained. If shared mobility schemes are expanded and can be used for complete journeys rather than just last mile journeys, again, some of this positive change can be maintained. However, in order to maximise this positive view, there are some things that need to happen. And some of this is already being done. The infrastructure needs to be improved, and there's some great work being done here by TfL and the boroughs. Complementary measures need to be added. For example, increase secure parking at home and at just destinations. If you've ever been to a Dutch cycle park, you'll see the scale of some of this. Also help with purchasing some of these vehicles. A bike is quite cheap, an e-bike less so. As I mentioned earlier, shared mobility schemes need to be significantly expanded and funded, and this could be through public funding or business partnerships. And also complementary modes need expanding to reduce the need to own a car. So this means things like car clubs. So thinking about the impact on travel patterns a little further, with current devices, there's a trip hierarchy. Interested to see if other panelists agree with this, but in my view, e-scooters are more of a short leisure or commuter mode. Cycling can be for shorter medium trips, both leisure and commuting. E-bike starts to become a longer leisure or commute journey. And it's quite simplistic, as it's simplistic in that both e-bikes and e-scooters can actually be additive to the mix of cycling, in that they can both add a new demographic to active and travelling in smaller vehicles in terms of gender, age, and ethnicity. So just thinking about, we talked about e-scooters and e-bikes. There are also newer devices which we've yet to see, but will likely emerge. There are vehicles that will carry more than one person, So I believe Bird is testing a vehicle which has 2 passengers. And there are speed e-bikes which travel faster. We haven't talked about e-mopeds yet, but there will be devices that fade away. So do you remember the Segway? We haven't seen that coming back as a major force. There are also new designs and business models which will arrive. Those of you who follow the news may have seen that there's a 2-seat electric vehicle being launched in Paris, which is a slow speed, more like a car-based vehicle, but it will be leased. You won't own it necessarily, and be available. You don't need a driving license to drive it. So we need to be aware that there are new devices. So just to conclude, each of these modes will have its benefits and drawbacks. And in a city like London, shared mobility will always be a more efficient use of space than private vehicles, whether they're cars, bikes, or e-scooters. And therefore, I suggest that the transport planning hierarchy of modes should recognise that shared modes are more desirable than private modes, given that they use infrastructure more efficiently, but importantly, require less parking, which is a real challenge, particularly at destinations. So just to sum up, there is a need to create both the most positive solutions for today, but to recognise the increased importance of mass public transport in cities in the density of London. So shared mobility and micromobility are absolutely important, but without mass public transport, it's going to be very tricky. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Some really insightful comments there. Definitely like the hierarchy of transport, very valid. And of course, we know that we had to look at this from the complementarity rather than a full replacement. Francesca, if I may come to you for some further reflections. Plexel has obviously been involved in what has been the only e-scooter trial to date in the UK in a fairly geographically limited environment on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. You're quite heavily involved in micromobility more broadly and innovation in mobility. So I wanted to kind of see what your views on, or having done this trial, how do you think things will change in the 6 to 9 months going forward? What's the potential for shared mobility in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Lucette. So for those, I suppose, that are not familiar with Plexel within the Here East campus, as Lucette mentioned, we're based on the Olympic Park, and for the past 18 months have been running a micromobility e-scooter trial with Bird. So Emma, I'm sure, will be able to also add lots of sort of flavour to the conversation around that experience. You know, I think super fortunate for us, as Lucette mentioned, we've been, you know, one of the only trials to take place for e-scooters, but also being able to do that with such close proximity to central London, albeit we were operating in a park environment. So for us, I think we've had huge amounts of learnings from that, which, given the current situation, you know, we're really keen to then continue to work with the likes of the local authorities and other organisations to support how e-scooters might therefore be deployed and trialled more broadly across London. I think there's a couple of kind of key things that sort of we've been thinking about and sort of working with organisations on in the last couple of months post lockdown. So I think really reiterating what both Richard and Matthew have said, we absolutely see e-scooters and shared micromobility being a very positive way of supporting the return to work post-COVID. I think some of the guidance that's come out from DFT has been fantastic in the way that it's been able to move very quickly towards sort of stipulating, I guess, some guidance around how these might be deployed and the roles and responsibilities that the local authority and the operator would need to have in place in order to do that successfully. But I think there's actually still quite a lot of gaps in terms of what the reality of deploying these types of devices in a city like London would look like. And I think for us, as I say, you know, we've been in contact, quite frustratingly actually, with nearly all of the local authorities in London to say, you know, let us help you. We've been through the experience of this. We understand some of the challenges around charging, around storage, and whether you want to have devices left overnight or not left overnight, etc. And I've had quite little response back. And I think it's because a lot of them are still unsure of what to do and how to do it. I think to Richard's point, without being able to find a way of managing the sort of cross-borough boundaries, it will just become quite an impossible task, I think, within London. And particularly, as you say, when you start thinking about multi-operators, different sort of borough rules and regulations and operational parameters in place, it actually could become a complete nightmare. So it really does need to be something that's really thought through, I think, and sort of supported on a cross-pan-London approach. I think from a use of the devices, I think there's been some key learnings that we've taken away, and Emma, as I say, will definitely be able to share some of those as well in terms of what works and how you would look to deploy these devices, and what sort of parameters you should have in place, as I say, around the charging of the devices, the storage, etc. I think what's been fantastic though, and I think what we'll continue to see in the next 6 months, is really a continuation of developments and improvements in devices, particularly in relation to things like self-cleaning handlebars, or starting to explore, actually, as has been happening already, whether there's going to be nuances to some of these devices to support individuals with more accessibility challenges, for example. I think what's been fantastic, as I say, is looking at how operators and SMEs and sort of innovative companies have responded to some of the challenges that COVID has presented in a way that actually has really enabled micromobility to flourish and, as I say, really support the sort of post-COVID return to work.
Thanks, Francesca. Again, some very valid points. I think a lot of panelists are on very similar pages, and it's good to know for us that we have experience of having done a trial in London. Greg, I thought I might come to you next. Some of the audience may not know this, but you're obviously joining us transatlantically. You are still on mute, you might have to unmute yourself. You have quite a broader view on this probably. So I thought I might ask you to maybe take us out of the London landscape for a little moment and kind of reflect on what the long-term impact could be of this pandemic and lockdown we're going through on the mobility landscape. Do you think that we are truly going to be able to capture this moment to build back better or accelerate our transition towards greener and cleaner mobility?
Well, I say, as the resident American on this panel, who is a Canadian emigre, it's a pleasure to be here in the Commonwealth, virtually and otherwise today. But yes, Commotion, by the way, is a US-based mobility conference. We have the opportunity of hosting a number of convenings like this, and so I have an opportunity to talk to a lot of executives. I guess the first point I want to make is to push back somewhat on the premise of this, which is that we know that there's data coming out of Japan and France, various studies to show that mass transit is in fact not a super spreader medium. There's been, I think, a lot of demonization of public transportation that's happened during the course of this pandemic. And it's going to take a lot of work for all of us to basically sort of undo that damage to various behaviors, sustainable behaviors. So really what we're talking about here is almost triage with micromobility. It has, of course, many benefits, but nothing can really replace that trunk carrying capacity of mass transit routes. So I'm hopeful that we'll see TfL, of course, being one of the leaders in this, and others really sort of roll out mass campaigns for mass distribution and changing social norms on mass transit to allow us to go back before further damage is done. With that, I mean, I don't want to be repetitive to my other panelists, but I have some few points I'd like to make on this that I think are quite interesting. One, here in North America and coming from the States, obviously we're much further along in the micromobility hype cycle, as Gartner would put it too. I think we're firmly into the trough of disillusionment there, but moving under the plateau of where it goes. And I think one of the things that's interesting here is that, and I'm sure Emma will have her own points on this, but that wave of venture capital fueled, blitz scaling and massive, horizontal spreading into various cities has now subsided. Now we're seeing sort of this desperate struggle to get to profitability and sustainability from there. We've seen Uber acquire Lime effectively or massively invest in it and bring it into its holdings. What I think is interesting there is, there's a couple of models going forward. Matthew referred to the notion that perhaps micromobility won't be a shared model after all. Perhaps it will be something where we'll see government subsidies like in Italy to purchase your own vehicles. And we'll see that as a policy choice that just as we purchase our own cars, we don't use car sharing en masse, perhaps we'll acquire that. Another one that's been promoted in various U.S. public transit agencies is the idea that we'll see closer linkages between the micromobility services and public transportation agencies to bring them formally into their route planning network. Now, what that might look like between Bird and TfL, I'll leave that to Emma. But this also ties into the larger notion of mobility as a service, which we've sort of stopped talking about a bit. But this notion of of integrated mobility plans tying into this. And I had a fun debate, I think 4 years ago with executives of TfL, where I argued, and I think I've been proven right on this, that they needed to regain control of their customers. They argued that the open data strategy and proliferating their route planning out to various apps was successful. I think we've seen the opposite is true. You need to have a relationship with your customers for route planning, having that data and allowing to have multiple modes. And I'm very hopeful that Berlin's Yelby model of bringing all these public and private modes into a single app and interface and booking and payment system could yet still carry the day. In the United States, Congress has apparently folding in the creation of an open booking and payment system into this big omnibus transportation bill. So we might see this yet become more widespread. And you know, and other models might appear too. You know, Spin, which is owned by Ford Motor here in the States, you know, they are actually talking to real estate companies, office holders and others to provide basically dock scooter stations as an amenity. So we could sort of see, you know, this is something going from either a subscription plan or ownership model to something you just use because your employer is making it possible for that. Other ideas there, I think, you know, one thing that we haven't discussed yet, which will be interesting to see is, you know, Los Angeles led the way in creating its own data specification for controlling micromobility, the so-called mobility data specification. Europe has trailed behind on this because of GDPR and tighter privacy restrictions. But I think we're going to start to see cities and start to see transit agencies like TfL will, you know, try to combat the return of commuter traffic and private cars by having more stringent software, by using this moment as a way to exert more control over the public realm, both physically and digitally. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that is deployed here to prevent this, because we know, you know, we can expect that London will see a surge in private cars. The data already coming out of China is extremely disheartening. Auto sales are up in China 7% in May year over year, 20% rise in SUVs and 47% rise in minivans, which I think is interesting because it speaks to the notion of, in the future, you want a room that moves, that is safe and secure. I mean, you can just sort of see the paranoia from the pandemic. Let's see, a couple other thoughts as well. I mean, you know, going to other forms of micromobility based on Matthew and based on Francesca's points as well. In addition to, you know, self-cleaning scooters, one of the things we might see sooner rather than later is self-driving scooters. We've already seen the deployments of prototypes of that in Singapore and in the United States. There's one called Tortoise that's actually deployed in ex-urban Atlanta. They're one of the municipalities outside of the core of Atlanta sort of issued an RFP because they wanted scooters to be able to basically deploy themselves off the streets at night. So we can start to imagine how these sort of teleoperated and other sorts of lightly autonomous micromobility devices might come back to central hubs for disinfecting, recharging, et cetera, and perhaps avoid some of the worst externalities there. And then the final point I want to make in this is, given that coming from an American perspective, I feel it's necessary to mention here, of course, the Black Lives Matter protests that have, of course, roiled the United States and much of the world over the last few weeks. And it's brought renewed attention to, the fact that, many communities of color and other marginalized communities have been pushed to the periphery of cities. And one of the things that's particularly true in the United States is that these programs to create safe streets and other micromobility corridors have really come to privilege those of us who are fortunate enough that we can work remotely from home. So therefore we can have this sort of constrained world within our neighborhoods or our boroughs and yet still participate fully in our jobs. And I think we need to do a better job of thinking about and planning here that if we're very serious about trying to capture this behavior change of people staying closer to home, lessening their commutes, trying to keep them out of private cars, we're going to need to think about how this applies to these marginalized communities of color who typically have been pushed to the periphery of Greater London, just like in every major Western city, and have had to endure these long commutes by the tube, by private car, whatever mode they can have. And we have to be very careful that we're not going to simply privilege our own preferences and privilege ourselves in this. I did a podcast last week with Dr. Destiny Thomas out of Oakland, and she called it a lot of the efforts that we're talking about here. She referred to them as white comfort, that we're basically creating, we're heightening the inequalities we've already put into cities by building these amenities for ourselves. So I hope we'll use this as a moment of reckoning to think about that as well.
Thanks, Greg, and some interesting new topics brought to the fore that will no doubt stimulate further thoughts and questions, which is starting to come in thick and fast, but particularly the concept of mass, which has indeed sort of gone off the radar a little bit, but also the point made around social inclusion and marginalized community, I think was very, very well made and very poignant. Probably could be talking for a few hours on that, no doubt. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to come next to Emma. Emma, you obviously work at Bird, one of the leading players in the micromobility space globally. So you probably also have a good kind of pan-urban environment view. I know you're joining us from what looks to be a very sunny garden in Amsterdam. What has been your experience of the role of micromobility and shared micromobility in the urban space? Is it really an alternative to the car, or is it more complementary? And how do you think that may change as a result of what we're going through at the moment?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me today. I was struggling to keep a straight face during Greg's speech because a really loud lawnmower has just started up behind me. So I really hope that you can hear me, and if you see a lawnmower go past, That's why I was laughing so hard, because he'd only just turned it on. I think that there've been a lot of great points made about the value of micromobility, and I don't say it lightly when I say that micromobility has revolutionised urban transport. I know Greg calls it a hype cycle, but I don't think this is a phase. Micromobility is absolutely here to stay in our cities, whether that's shared, whether that's privately owned, or whatever form. There's various form factors here as well. There's scooters, there's e-bikes, there's e-mopeds, as we've heard at, and who knows what next. In terms of what it can do for London, I think that what Sir Joseph Bazalgette did for health and sanitation and cleaning up the River Thames by inventing a sewer system for London is comparable to what scooters can offer to UK cities. It is that sort of type of revolution. It's going to be a new, clean, green form of transport. And that is even more important in the post-COVID world, where for the first time we've seen governments in the UK and across Europe actually trying to, asking people to stay away from public transport, and capacity of public transport reduced down to sort of 5%, 10%. So even before COVID, people took scooters in incredible numbers. I think it still astonishes me today, the NACTO survey of micromobility use, which was taken in 2018 and published in April last year. And they've surveyed bike share in the US for about 8 years. And bike shares gradually got up to a level where you get about 38 million rides a year now in the USA. In 2018, which was the first year of electric scooter sharing, there were 38.5 million rides taken on shared electric scooters. So in just 1 year, shared electric scooters did what it took dockless and station-based bike share about 8 years to achieve. So people have really, really taken to micromobility quickly. And I do believe that that's what we're going to see happening in London once we see the vehicles legalised, and in fact in cities across the UK. The main way that we've seen people using them from Bird's experience is not just as a final mile, also change the way that they move around cities, because they've found that they can reach shops and businesses that were previously quite far from public transit stations much more easily. During the COVID crisis, healthcare workers used our scooters to be able to get to and from work when they didn't want to take public transport, or indeed it wasn't operating at the time they needed it to. During the metro strikes in Paris, we saw these e-scooters for Bird go up by about 300%, because other than that or bike share, there was no other way to get to work during those strikes. And of course, in the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, which Francesca from Plexel mentioned earlier, we've had our trial there for 1.5 years where we've been operating. We see a lot of tourists and leisure users there, but also people using that service to get from Stratford train station to the Here East and the Plexel co-working space. So really using it as part of their daily commute. I do get asked a lot about mode shift and whether or not people are going to use scooters as an alternative to the car. I think there's a bit of a fixation with the idea that every single journey that's taken on a scooter is replacing another journey that would have been taken by another mode of transport. I think in many instances we're actually making the whole pie bigger rather than slicing it up in different ways. We're actually creating new journeys, as I mentioned, areas that were previously hard to reach because they were far away from public transport. Those areas in cities like London become a lot more accessible once you have micromobility like e-scooters. I think the picture on mode shift is probably a bit different between Europe and the US, and that's a lot due to the fact that you have a lot higher levels of car ownership and usership in US cities to what you do in Europe. But what we have seen is that we're not taking away from bike share use. And that NACTO survey that I mentioned earlier, it again is an example of this. When electric scooters were introduced, we did 38.5 million rides in 1 year. In that same year, bike share still increased from what it had done the year before. So we're not cannibalizing bike share in cities where it exists. And if you look at a study from the city of Portland in Oregon, they actually showed that I think the use of the local bike share scheme actually increased. So in many ways, I think that, I think of electric scooters as a sort of like gateway drug for getting people out of their cars. Once you've left your car at home, once you've chosen that other option, you're much more likely to use it again, and you're much more likely to perhaps, walk in between different parts of your journey, different parts of your day. So it's really just about changing people's mindset from a car first mindset to making another choice first, particularly when they're in cities. I can see that loads of people are champing at the bit in the chat window to ask some questions. So Lisa, I'll hand it back to you to take us through those.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for giving that perspective from an operator point of view. It's good to have all the different views. Richard, I'm going to quickly come back to you for maybe a sort of a minute of reflective comments on what has come after your fantastic introductions and sort of painting the landscape. Maybe picking up a little bit on the mass comment that Greg made earlier. You know, what is there needed in terms of action to ensure shared mobility can kind of form part of this mobility as a service and integrate better with the mass transit, which I think everyone agrees we will still need and will need to return to, particularly in the larger cities. So I was wondering if you could give us another short reflective comment before we come on to questions.
Sure, thank you. I will keep it brief. So there's some super points made there by the panelists. What do we need to do? Let's divide that into two camps. What do we need to do negatively, if you like? So here I touched on closing off road space and other restrictions. You've seen modifications to the congestion charge come through in London at UK government behest. The ultra-low emission zone expansion is still planned for next autumn, 2021. But I think ideally, we need to be going further than that over time. You know, we really, as a city like London, really needs to look at its private car patterns, its private car ownership, and its parking regimen, everything that goes to that. This is where it gets politically a bit sticky, and for any fans of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister, it's where politicians start thinking they need to be brave. But actually I think they do need to be brave and show some leadership on this alongside officials, other policymakers and influencers. There is a negative side to this that needs to be exercised, the sticks. The positive side, the carrots, so I think there's huge opportunity for some cross-promotion and communication support for shared transport options as part of this bigger sustainable transport spectrum. So that's public transport, shared and active, where it isn't just about messaging, hopefully, but that can also be about incentivization. You know, very interested to see just little embryonic signs in Coventry and a couple of the places in the UK of credit systems being used. That's much more widely used in other parts of the world. Something I think's got huge potential. In essence, we need to make it the quick, cheap, pleasant version of things is to do the right thing for most journeys. We're never going to get 100% of the way there. The Mayor's transport strategy doesn't aim for that. It aims for 80% of the way there. But London pre-COVID was hovering around high 63, 64%. And that last chunk, you know, is going to be tricky. So this isn't just all going to be business as usual, and it isn't just all going to be soft, quiet measures. There's a good time for some radical interventions too.
Thanks, Richard. Carrot and stick it is, not just sticks. So we're sort of coming up to the sort of end of part one, if you like. I'm going to do two things before I pick up on the loads of questions that are coming in. One is to launch another poll. So having now heard all these wonderful insights from our panel, I'm going to ask the audience, do you see micromobility as a key method for how you'll move around the city in the future? This is a very straightforward yes or no answer, so hopefully that doesn't give you too long to think. And in the same instance, I'm going to ask Kat from NLA to also bring up Tom Darcy, City Growth Director from London at Jacobs, who's going to shortly share some of his reflections on what the panel have discussed as soon as we have launched and closed our poll and shared our results. Well, let's see. There's an overwhelming, I think, yes, probably unsurprisingly so, but nonetheless interesting because we may have had some very different views had we asked this question months ago. So our panelist has done a great job at persuading everyone that micromobility is the way to go. So lots of great options for no doubt for both other operators to come into the market. So welcome to Tom. As I mentioned, Tom is the City Growth Director for London at Jacobs, one of the world's leading engineering companies, major player in the transport space, also very active on innovation and also a very large employer globally. Tom, I was wondering if you could give us some short reflections on what you've heard from the panel and what that means for a company like Jacobs.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the first thing is just a hugely exciting collection of ideas and suggestions. London has always been a great city for progressing and moving with the times. And one of the great things about London as a city is the diversity and options we already have in terms of getting around. And I think what we've talked about today is only going to add to that diversity of choice that we have going forward. I think the thing that's really impressive is the speed of innovation. I guess hearing it in the last 30 minutes has really brought home just the speed of innovation, the speed of change, and the speed of collaboration and integration between disciplines and organizations. And that's kind of been a positive, I think, of the COVID experience. And we have definitely seen that in our business, working with clients across the globe, that one of the positives around COVID has brought industry, private, public sector disciplines together to innovate really, really quickly. And I guess the building on that as well, with that topic of speed, now is a fantastic time as well now to achieve what a lot of cities have been working towards. Richard, you referred to at the end, that last difficult push in terms of achieving the Mayor's Transport Strategy. Now is kind of a pivot point, really. If we really work together collectively as those industries, if we really push ourselves hard, we really can achieve that last push in working towards the Mayor's Transport Strategy goals for London. And I guess the last sort of point that I kind of wanted to maybe take advantage of my position here and ask the panel on is around safety. Fantastic to hear about innovations around self-cleaning handlebars and stuff like that. Those kind of items will help people make that move and use this new technology. So, what else do we need to do to ensure that people feel confident and that the safety measures are there to use this new technology going forward? Because if we're going to go for this inclusive approach, we're going to have lots of different people from different types of background, society, experience, etc. Everyone needs to feel confident in using these new techniques and informed. So maybe a question back out to the panel around safety there.
Thanks, Tom. Very good question. I'm actually going to take the liberty as a chair to wrap that in with a couple of questions that are quite related to this. So one question's been asked around, will e-scooters be allowed in cycle lanes? And if so, it's essential to have wide cycle lanes. Somebody's having some difficult experiences of having cycled around London throughout lockdown and having some not so good encounters with e-scooters. So we do see them on the roads, even though they aren't actually legal. And then there's also a question around how will e-scooters be kept off pavement? So again, I think that's quite related to safety. So I might just bring those all together and maybe ask Matthew for some initial reflections. And I'm going to ask for comments to be kept short as we want to go through a couple more questions if we can.
Sure, thanks, Lisette. So safety, I think any new mode will have safety concerns to begin with. The bicycle was a penny farthing to begin with, so it had a very large front wheel and a very small back wheel and no brakes. So I think vehicles will evolve, and also it's important that there's both infrastructure provided which is suitable for the demand and also training available. So I don't think we've got all the answers yet, but I think those are some of the options.
Yeah, and that's obviously why we also need to do trials. Francesca, any views from you? Obviously, having been involved in the trial, any comments on safety? I know it was not on public roads, but
yeah, no, I mean, certainly. So I think actually it is, as the device, I think, and the sort of setup of the device is actually as important as how they're deployed. And I think that's kind of one of the real things, and goes back to the comments earlier from both Richard and Matthew around how the local boroughs in London are going to come together in order to do this. I think, we had huge amounts of learnings from a safety point of view. And I think what we've seen over the last year and 18 months is actually a real growth in the devices. So obviously potholes are particularly dangerous to e-scooters. So we've seen a real kind of change, I guess, in the way that lots of these devices are structured, from a wheel size, from where the battery is stored, being therefore not in the sort of the column with the handlebars, but actually at the bottom of the device, because it creates more of a sort of centre of gravity. I think one of the challenges, I think, with which is actually quite apparent at the minute, is the challenge with personal ownership versus ownership of devices and sort of deployment of devices from operators. I think when you've got operators that are responsible, there are means and ways in which you control how these devices run. So there are speed restrictions that you can put in place. There are geofencing that you can put in place. You have to evidence that your device has been parked in an appropriate place and not just dumped on the street or left in the middle of the pavement, which obviously is then very difficult for anyone with a pram or with an accessibility challenge. So I think there is such better ways of controlling it when you've got an operator that is responsible for doing it, and it's much easier to work with the operator and a local authority to manage that. I think where we're going to start to see challenges, because obviously the announcement came out, is I think there's been a real surge in personal usage and personal ownership of these devices, and you just don't have the same means and ways of trying to control it. And I think you also don't have the same means and ways of identifying which ones belong to a personal user versus an operator. So I think that's where some of the challenges are going to come in. But I think actually there are really, really good ways of managing it and deploying these safely when done appropriately and are really considered, and when in collaboration between an operator and a local authority.
Thanks, Francesca. I'm going to go on to the next question, which is an easy question, not an easy question. When will the bylaw on dockless bikes be published? Probably an interesting one. Richard, any thoughts on that? I'm not sure we have an answer to that. But.
No, we don't. Of course, COVID affected, as with so much here, and I think we shouldn't underestimate actually the impact of COVID on the resources of government, whether that's national, regional, or local, to grapple with these issues that we're all merrily talking about here. I would hope that it's the next few months in terms of it's moving through its next phase, which is Secretary of State sign-off and the short consultation. But I don't know more than anyone else. There is work going on in the background, as I said, but it's far from a done deal. It's worth saying it does require the formal written agreement of all London boroughs. So that has to be in place before it can even exist. And there are also massive questions that it throws open. So while I'm very hopeful that it can mark a turning point on lots of thorny issues for greater use of shared transport in London, it doesn't guarantee that. And there's loads of work still to be done. The draft bylaw itself is only about a page and a half, and raises lots of questions.
Thanks, Richard. Next question. If the government goes ahead with its zoning proposals, perhaps one of the overriding principles for highways should be a new priority of pedestrian, pedal, micromobility, and public transport with the private car at the bottom, ? So actually I'm going to come to Greg and see what he's maybe seen elsewhere as well. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, two thoughts on this, particularly again from North America, is we're seeing that the next wave of building safe streets or slow streets, whatever, will be can we take it to the arterials, whether that's highways and elsewhere, and like what kind of hard structures can you build into the pavements to protect the safety of cyclists and other active transportation users. But I think besides that, there will also be, and I think this is likely to happen as well, is there's going to be this sort of digital enforcement, as I talked about earlier. So I've worked with a startup in New York called ClearRoad that actually has basically software that is embedded in vehicles that does kilometer-based road pricing. So it's, instead of a congestion zone like Central London has, of course, it's just basically you set the charges and however long it travels, that's how long it charges. The point is that, we could easily see governments start to take that sort of geofence principle that Francesca mentioned and overlay it on top of streets. So you could imagine that hierarchy that the person asked could be basically digitally encoded before we build it into the pavement. Imagine a sort of complete congestion pricing scheme for all of Greater London, where, basically the type of vehicle being used is paying different fees. Or we can also imagine striating the street space so that, the lane that is set aside for micromobility is free to use, assuming it's done appropriately. We could see, higher capacity shared vehicles, pay less, and et cetera from there. So I think we're going to see governments turn to that first because, of course, it's much easier to implement code and push that out there, and then perhaps only later we'll see it implemented in concrete. Code is the new concrete, as LADOT Chief Selita Reynolds likes to say.
I like that one. That's a new one to add to my vocabulary, I think. Code is the new concrete. Richard, how does that ring true for you?
Yeah, there's a lot that can be done with data and good analysis of data and harnessing the power of these software platforms that it was such early days on this. I mean, to Matthew's penny farthing, good analogy, because we inevitably like to think we've got our heads around all this, and Uber or whoever's been around for a while, but actually these capabilities are increasing all the time, and we've got a long way to go. I think there's lots of missing pieces of that jigsaw, actually. So from a sort of public sector perspective, I think thinking of a city like London, it has a great London data store, curated by the GLA, which is fantastic. But if you look at what's in there, it's really public sector data that's in there. And there's a huge opportunity and need to get private sector data in there in an appropriate way that's, of course, GDPR compliant. Doesn't run any risks of personal data being inadvertently revealed, is thoroughly legal and so on. But we're quite a long way yet from really being able to look across the piece and understand who's moving where and why in London. And that lack of knowledge is quite dangerous because it enables lots of assumption-based decision-making, where actually really, we should be having analysis-based decision-making. To add to your stock of phrases, Lucette, I like the Michael Bloomberg one about in God we trust, but all others bring data. Also
a good one. Heard it here first. Thanks, Richard. I'm mindful of the time, so I think we'll take one final question. There's loads, so I do apologise. One question, I think, reflecting more specifically on the London landscape and the fact that we have, 33 local authorities with different approaches. Has the Greater London Authority tried to lead the way with a London-wide standard, and should the GLA take a stronger lead? It's probably a question mainly for Richard and Matthew, but I'll maybe come to Matthew first for what your thoughts on that.
I guess, actually, anyone who's familiar with London will understand the complication of GLA, TfL, London councils and various other parties, and that's before you get to the 32 boroughs and the City of London. The point about the dockless bylaw, I think, is relevant here because that is the attempt to try and coordinate things at a borough level, so have a consistent approach, at least in some matters across boroughs. Now, when that was designed, it was designed to think about dockless bikes. But it was specifically designed as the dockless vehicle bylaw. So the purpose of it was recognising that e-scooters were on their way. So one of the challenges is that the technologies and the business models move faster than the legal system and agreements between 33 organisations. So we're not quite there yet. But that's a starting point. It doesn't address everything. It doesn't provide common standards. But I understand, and perhaps Richard can add to this, that there is at least talk of some guidelines being developed.
Thanks, Matthew. I'm mindful we're literally 1 minute away from closing our session, so I think we'll have to keep it here. Lots of interesting thoughts, and I hope that our audience enjoyed it as much as I did.